we're just leaving St. Anthony's. Next spot will be Greenland somewhere.
Although Greenland is due north from here, it might be the safest thing to do would be just to go east for the first day or something, out until we get to about 53 degrees west or something, just out here, because most of the bergs are up in this part, and if we go straight to where we want to go, we'll just be going through berg after berg all night long, and we'll probably run into one.
Look, an ice bag.
It's our 15th iceberg, and it's not even morning tea time yet. Pretty foggy at the moment too, which makes it really hard to spot icebergs and growlers and things like that. The weather on the crossing from Canada to Greenland wasn't quite what we hoped, and it started off really nicely as the weather predictions showed, but then a couple of days in we got sort of fairly smashed by a nasty low pressure system that came along for a couple of days, and then it started to weaken again, but then it got joined by this other big low from the bottom, and they kind of combined and it just got pretty crazy. Sort of 35 knots. That was about what it was before we went down below and just hove to and pretended we were somewhere else.
I got horrendously seasick, and not only seasick but very anxious as well. I was just scared. I wanted to be anywhere else in the world except where I was.
Jess was so seasick, it was pretty scary actually for her and for me, and she couldn't do anything without being violently ill. The whole boat stank of vomit, which wasn't very pleasant. I did what I could to kind of comfort her and give her fluids and stuff, but I'm so glad when it calmed down in the end. Land ho! Greenland, just over there, about 40 miles away. So after 9 days at sea, we're finally just a couple of hours away from reaching Greenland at last. This is looking pretty bad actually. The closer we get to Greenland, I've started to see this thin white line on the horizon, and it's looking more and more like continuous unbroken ice. We're 20 miles off the shore, and it's just, you can't get any closer than this. But Nuuk, thankfully, the capital of Greenland, is ice-free, and we should be able to get there. But it's about 5 days away. So as we got pretty close to Greenland, we passed a big British cruise ship, luxury passenger liner thing, and we got chatting to the skipper on the VHF radio, and he brought up the conversation about the weather, because he was like, oh my god, the weather was pretty crazy you guys just went through.
You must have been through some serious seas getting here. I mean, we had effectively force 12 weather getting here.
Yeah, it wasn't much fun at all. That's kind of why we were hoping to pull in here and lick our wounds a little bit.
Well, you did well getting through that weather. I mean, we were recording 10 to 12 meter waves at one stage, so yeah, that was quite impressive.
Of course, the duct tape covering the punctures in our flexible water tank didn't last more than about a day of this crossing to Greenland, so it all drained away in the first few days, and it's been day 10 now, so we've just been living off our 50-litre reserve bladder. This is our much stronger Turtle Pack flexible tank, which is much better. So our basic theory at night, when it gets too dark to see ice and stuff, was basically just to hove to, so you don't really sail anywhere, and then try and get some sleep and then wake up and keep going at the first bit of light at about 3 AM. But there was this one morning where we woke up, and just peeping out through the window, I suddenly spotted this little bit of ice out there, and I was like, ah! And jumped out, and we were just surrounded by growlers and bergy bits like everywhere. We were just in this field of ice. It was so crazy. We must have somehow drifted into it, or it must have drifted onto us during the night. And we just turned the motor on and went, ah! And just got out of there. That was our first sort of introduction to lots of ice around us. This morning we used the engine for about 5 minutes, and then it ran out of fuel, which sucked, and then so we refueled it back up, and I bled the whole engine, and it still wouldn't start. And I've been progressively taking the engine apart since about literally 3 o'clock this morning. I've bled the system about 5 times. I've taken the injector apart twice. There's water throughout the whole cylinder. I'm not even sure how it got there. And we're in a hurry to get to Nuuk because there's 35 knot massive gale, worse than we just had, coming in about 2 and a bit days, and we're not going to get there. So after spending literally 9 hours yesterday morning continuously working, leaning over this engine, trying to get it to work, taking apart basically everything there is to take apart and putting it back together, finally managed to get it to work, which was, amazing. I didn't think we were going to get it ever to work again. And then we had it running for about 4 hours, and then it suddenly stopped again, and just stopped dead, and there were squealing belts and everything, and the engine wouldn't turn. I thought we'd seized the engine. But then it turned out it was a starter motor, which you can see I've now ripped off the starter motor behind me, and I'm going to try and see if I can fix that later on. But we can actually start the thing by hand. It's just a hell of a lot of hard work, and it's particularly reluctant to start these days as well, which makes it extra tricky. All the icebergs out there are just so beautiful, and everyone's so different. And it was great. We had a bit of calmish weather, so we put the GoPro camera on the end of our ice pole, stuck it underwater, and got some really cool vision of the underside of the icebergs, which was great. And eventually we found a really cool looking iceberg, a really tall one with 2 big towers, and I thought, oh, wouldn't it be awesome to get a photo of Teleport in the middle of those towers. And this is when we were just coming into Nook, and we thought, alright, so we decided to try and slow the boat down. And we found that we couldn't change the pitch on the propeller, so we were stuck in forward basically. We couldn't go to neutral or reverse, and we couldn't also stop the engine because we didn't know we could get it started again. So we decided, well, we're gonna have to get the dinghy in the water while we're driving ahead in full forward. So that was exciting. We managed to get the dinghy in there and do it all right. And basically I hopped in the little dinghy and rowed around to one side of the berg while Jess sailed around the other side. Meanwhile, actually one of the huge towers collapsed and went into the water, which was kind of frightening, but we weren't close enough to be in any danger. But then Jess sailed past and I just sat there in the dinghy going click, 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 and got some really cool shots, which was great. Look what I got! It's a growler. A bit of an iceberg. I think that'll go well in our icebox to keep all our food nice and cold. That's actually very solid.
So after about 12 days at sea, we eventually arrived in Nook, which is the capital of Greenland, and because we had still engine problems, couldn't reverse, couldn't go into neutral, we had to pull alongside and raft up to the oldest, rustiest looking fishing boat that we could find. Nook was a beautiful city, like colourful houses and hills with snow-capped mountains. It was really, really nice.
I took our Dynastart starter motor thing to a local electrical mechanic in Nook, and that afternoon he got back to me and said, right, well, I've taken it apart and it's basically completely broken. He's never seen one that mangled in his whole life, wires and stuff tangled in everything, and he said can't be repaired. But it just so happens that down in the garage they had basically a brand new one, a very similar model that had just been sitting there for as long as he could remember, which is amazing because this kind of technology isn't used anymore. You know, he was like saying this is probably the only one in the whole of Greenland. It wouldn't surprise me. And I took it back and it fitted. I only had to bend a few things on the engine to fit this new one in, and it worked. It was brilliant. So this morning's job is to try and take the head off the engine, which is something I never really wanted to do. But now I've actually discovered a problem bad enough that I'm really hoping that it's the head gasket that's blown and not something worse. I can't see any obvious hole in the water gaskets here, which is kind of annoying because I was kind of hoping I'd find a big hole in the water gasket which would explain where all that water was coming from. So maybe it's a little worse than we thought. So I've discovered what it is. There's a big hole that's rusted through between the exhaust sort of outlet and water cooling, which is supposed to be a totally separate system, just cooling it. And there's a rust hole there, you can see it's just rusted right through, so the cooling water's mixing with the exhaust right sort of at the top of the cylinder, so water's going back into the cylinder, and it's kind of what I feared. So I just walked all over town asking people, you know, oh, do you reckon you can weld this? Can we fill up the hole with weld? And I got taken to various welding experts, and they're all like, no, you can't weld that. And then one of them just said, oh no, you should just use this metal epoxy stuff. You know, it's like dries in 5 minutes, and apparently it holds up to about 150 degrees Celsius, which should be fine. And, you know, it's strong and resists oil and all that kind of stuff. And he said, yeah, just mix that up and squish it in there and that'll be fine. So, please let that be true. But for the stuff to dry, it's got to be 15 degrees or more. And the boat was about 10 degrees, so we've got the lanterns on, we have the stove on, and it looks like the temperature's getting up around 20 degrees now. So the final problem with the engine, which turned out to be the biggest problem of all, was that damn reverse pitch thing, the thing that changes the pitch of the propeller. And having gone through the manual for the engine that lists all the possible reasons why the pitch control might jam, the last ones were basically it's got to be a problem with the propeller. So, you know, you have to take the boat out of the water to get to the propeller. And the crane came along and put the slings around the boat and then started to lift it up, and then it actually slipped. The whole thing went shook. And then they hoisted it up again and lifted it out over the concrete, and Jess and I sitting there going, you know, don't drop, don't drop. And they just balanced it there. We kind of hid under there and took the propeller apart and cleaned it all up with grease and stuff, and then found that the problem wasn't in the propeller after all. So we basically had to put the yacht back in the water, and then we very carefully motored back to our place, still without any control over the engine, and then had to take the whole clutch mechanism, pitch control mechanism box apart out of the engine. It turned out though that to get that box off the front of the engine, we actually had to undo the engine mounts and lift the entire engine up, which is a pretty major job, but luckily a very friendly couple on a British yacht turned up and gave us a hand, which was fantastic. And then, you know, when we finally got the box off the end, we had no way of freeing up the part that had jammed together. You know, we started out nice and easy, just tapping it with a hammer. It didn't do anything. We even heated it with a blowtorch to try and warm up and expand the out a bit and chill the in a bit and try and do whatever we possibly could to get this thing apart. And nothing. We literally spent days over it. It was really annoying. In the end, we decided we'd take it to a local mechanic, and we basically sort of showed that what needed to be done. They eventually got to a bigger hammer and gave it a really big belt, and they started to shift it, and they finally got it apart. And then it took me another day and a half to actually get the whole thing to be polished up enough that it would freely slide together again the way it was supposed to go. But eventually, finally, we got it all back together working. Annoyingly, after we ran the engine for a long period of time with the new Dynastart in there, the Dynastart started to get really, really hot, you know, way hotter than it should. So I've disconnected it, and we're just going to start the motor by hand. It's easy enough to do. So we're sick of our flexible water tank here leaking on us all the time and losing all of our water. So we're going to pull it out, and instead we're just going to use these little 10-litre jerry cans. We'll just put a whole lot of them in here instead. So we finally left Nook yesterday. The weather was good and we got everything fixed up, and we did a short sail across. We were going to go through an inland route, inland passage, but some friends of ours were just ahead of us, and they hit a rock, an unmarked rock, because the chart's not very complete around there. And so we pulled into a nice little anchorage nearby and used our underwater GoPro camera on a stick to inspect their damage, and they've just got a chunk taken out of their fiberglass, but they're okay. And then it was a lovely spot. We ran a rope ashore and an anchor, and we were snug in this lovely little, in between all these hills. Went ashore and explored, and now we're off, heading up towards Disco Bay.